So good morning to all of you. Welcome to the session number 36, Economic Policies Paradigm Shift. I'm Bénédicte TASSART. I'm working for RTL. I'm a reporter. We have 4 members. We have Jean PISANI-FERRY from the Cercle des Économistes. You can ask your questions on the site lesrencontreséconomiques.fr. François Villeroy de GALHAU, Governor of the Banque de France, State Secretary Jörg KUKIES, Claire WAYSAND, General Head of Engie, temporary General Manager for Engie, and Stefanie STANTCHEVA. You've got the best you got the reward, the best economist last year. So we will listen to you, and let us start with the Governor of the Banque de France, François Villeroy de GALHAU. So the post-COVID emergency is being sorted out. What about reconstruction? A paradigm shift. When you talk about a paradigm shift, we have to be ambitious. We can change the economy, and I think that we'll have to change the economy. But allow me to talk about the change to economic policies, because this is part of my remit. Before answering your question on the post-crisis, allow me to talk about the previous crisis, 2009. What was the paradigm shift in 2009? There are 2 sustainable aspects. You have to consider the monetary policy. Before the financial crisis, most economists zero-bound border, and the central banks were able to act. But below that limit, they didn't know how to act. After the crisis, the European Central Bank and other banks launched non-conventional instruments. I'm not going to elaborate on that. A negative rate purchase of securities. Massive purchase of securities. So these were temporary instruments, but in fact, they've lasted. So the non-conventional instruments have become conventional instruments. And there's a second change. You have to consider the national budget policies. In short, so Germany has turned out to be Keynesian. Jörg, this is a compliment, and France hasn't been able to be Keynesian-based. So Germany advocated a counter-cycle budget policy. When the situation is good, you have to reconstitute every room for maneuver, and you have to reduce debt. And when you are in a crisis, as it is the case, you have to use the margins for maneuver. This is what Germany did. France didn't do that. So when things were going well in France, we continued to increase debts. Regarding the budget policy, we can innovate in terms of taxes and income and revenues. So we are the champions of tax instability, but we cannot challenge the spending aspect, and that's our main problem. So these are the achievements, and now I will talk about what is new today and what could change, what could be the paradigm shift if you consider the economic policies. So there are 2 aspects that I need to consider, 2 positive aspects. First of all, we have an opportunity here. So there has been a controversial aspect, the monetary policy that is common and that is European, and the budget policies are national. But we can add a third component, a European budget policy, a common one. This is something that we could add, and I think that this is the main breakthrough of the Franco-German agreement, followed by the proposal of the Commission. And there's another aspect. We shouldn't bet on macroeconomic policies. I mean, we expect a lot from the budget policy or from the monetary policy. We should focus on the structural transformation of the economy. We have 2 major transitions to achieve in Europe. First, the climate transition, ecological transition, and the digital transition. And at the end of the day, Europeans are united. I mean, they see eye to eye on these transitions. I can tell you that in terms of in terms of ecological transition, we are ahead of other European, of other continents. But if you consider the European package that is on the table, we need to protect the European added value in order to achieve these two structural transformations. So Jörg might be talking about that, but we don't want a bargaining process. We just want a European added value. And that's it. But Jörg, I think that you will be talking about that. Hi, can you hear us? So there's a paradigm shift in Germany, so revisiting the Maastricht criteria, a common debt with 27 countries. Germany has become a Keynesian. So how can you explain to that, and how far do you want to go?
So I think we are very surprised that everyone is surprised. Let me put it this way, because if you listen to pretty much every speech by Minister Schulz in the Bundestag, in public, wherever, he always said that the only reason for a sound fiscal policy in the good times is to have the firepower to do a Keynesian anti-cyclical policy once things go wrong. As late as September 2019, when he presented the 2020 initial budget, that was the core of his speech. So in that sense, it's very natural that we are using our fiscal space at the moment to counter the trend in our economy, which is very negative, as it is everywhere in the world. But it's something that we also did in 2009 after the financial crisis. So the short-term labor schemes were basically invented back then. What we added this time, and that is in fact new, is the guarantee programs through KfW to assure the lending to the real economy. But the basic idea that we reduce our debt to GDP very strongly so that we have firepower to react. That is something that is not completely new at all in Germany. What is new, I would say, or what we hope that we are bringing to the table is a very strong pro-European stance, but it's not completely new either, because Germany has always been pro-European. The fact that we've now agreed with France on the 500 billion proposal, I think, is a very positive signal, and we work very hard, obviously, from March, and especially with the French finance minister at our level. First of all, to just before Easter, get the 540 billion lending program through ESM, EIB, and the Commission going, and then later to develop the plan for a 500 billion spending proposal. That also isn't completely new. From the Meseberg cooperation to the joint work on future of the capital markets union, the banking union, the Eurozone budget, Germany and France, since I've taken office, I haven't known it any other way, have always been working extremely closely together to come up with all of these proposals. Hopefully this one will be a quicker success than the previous one.
Ce que vous voulez dire, donc, Monsieur Cookies, c'est que nous avons...
Mr. Cookies, so in fact, we've already embarked upon a paradigm shift. So you have COVID and climate change. So with climate change, we can change the paradigm shift. So we've talked about macroeconomics, and macroeconomics plays a key role. And I think that we've learned a lot from the financial crisis. And I think that we shouldn't withdraw some support too early to the economy. Otherwise, growth would be very slow. For the economic policy, there are two priorities. So to avoid the sustainable effect of this crisis, sustainable effect that would be undesirable, things that could penalize investment in the economy. I think that the whole economy should be in a position to get some perspective so that they can invest. People, young people who enter the labor world should find some jobs. So when there's a crisis, it's very difficult to get a job, especially for young people. And there's a second top priority, and this is an opportunity. So this crisis is an opportunity that we can tap, i.e. we have the ability through the public action and through the corporate actions, we have the ability to put the economy on a sustainable path. I would say that our economies, when they worked, they were not sustainable. It was not compatible with the climate change fight. So we would have ended up in big difficulties, even over the past few years. That have a look at the temperatures in the Arctic Circle 2 weeks ago, 38 degrees. 38 degrees, it means that the planet is in a bad condition. You have some frozen areas that are thawing. So the condition, the state of the planet is really disastrous, catastrophic. So through public action that is well targeted, that is well designed, we can change the previous trajectory and we can put the global economy towards a sustainable path. So what does it mean? Two things. We need to reduce our energy consumption. All the studies and surveys converge. Combating climate change means that we need to reduce our energy consumption by 40%. This is huge. This is huge. During the crisis, we've seen that the reduction was less. Today, gas and electric consumption today, when it is compared with an equivalent period where the crisis, we are 5% below. So collectively in Europe and elsewhere, we need to reduce drastically our energy consumption. Is it possible? Yes, it is possible. It is possible. It's 40%, it's possible. It means that we need to change attitudes. And one of the positive aspects of this crisis is that we've shown that we can change our behaviors. We worked from home, and I can tell you that the world economy worked. And at Engie, for example, 65,000 people were able to work from home. So we can change the attitudes, and 40% is possible. So in terms of thermal renovation, for example, we can reduce the electricity bill by 30%. If your buildings are well insulated, you can save some energy. So it's possible to decrease the consumption of energy, and energies, should be greener. So it's important, to develop the electric energy, and it has to be greener. The price of solar industry has been divided by 10, and for wind energy, the price has decreased by 70%. But these are some intermittent energies. So what does it mean? These energies, they can produce when there is sun or when there is wind. So we should find some renewable energies that do not present these problems. Or you can store energy, but there are two ways of storing. There are some batteries. But with batteries, you can store energy only for a few days, and you can store gas. So gas can be green, and we have two types of green gases that are being developed. And I think that all studies have converged, so we can have an energy mix that is carbon-free, i.e. more renewable electrical energy and green gases, two gases. So biomethane, this is green gas. For those who are in the regions and for those who are on the move, you can see a big tanks that are round. So these are methanizers. So it's possible to produce green methane. And the second, green hydrogen. Green hydrogen, it's very promising. So these two green gases, should be supported. So what is green hydrogen? To produce hydrogen through hydrolysis, you put water, you use energy. It can be electric energy produced by photovoltaic energy, and then you can supply a kind of energy that can be stored and that can be reused. But of course, this implies investment and research, and I think that we'll be talking about that during the debate. So the Green Avenue, Stefanie STANTCHEVA, hi. Are you with us? So let's talk about training and employment for a new start. So there are lots of things that are pivotal at the end of a crisis. But for me, there's something that is pivotal. There should be a fresh paradigm in the labor market. It's a matter of creating jobs. To create good jobs so the COVID crisis has laid bare significant fractures, rifts. You have the metropolitan households, richer households making the most of globalization. And you had underprivileged families on the other. So there are some proposals for reforms in order to change the economy. But what is important is to change the approach to market economics. We need to take up the challenge to reorganize production. How do we produce? Who works and how? So there are some similarities as part of the reforms that we want to envisage. To prepare manpower so that they can use technologies. It's important to train people. And all young people should take into account the new requirements of the labor market. So there will be new working conditions that are atypical. So there are lots of proposals so that workers have more bargaining power. I think that there will be a new form of social dialogue between employers and employees. There are lots of reforms on progressive tax regimes. What is important is to reduce the income inequalities. What is important is to have a fairer and better competition. But we need to go even further. In fact, we should change our strategy regarding jobs. So you have poverty, inequalities, exclusion, insecurity. So these aspects are a reality when you produce and when you innovate. So the decisions taken by companies have externalities. So there's an impact on other people, impact on other sectors of economy. And this can be a positive externality. I have in mind innovation, apprenticeship, research, development, but these externalities can be negative. So Mrs. WAYSAND has talked about climate change, GAGs. So this is what I would call external negative externalities. And then what is important is to have good jobs. So good jobs mean jobs that are stable and you can get a good wage in order to make a living. You can save money. What is important is to make sure that people can climb up the career ladder, and companies will contribute to the vitality of their communities. But these good jobs, can you see them? What is the strategy of companies? There are lots of things that can change. A shortage of good jobs, this is not good because the social costs are very high. So there might be a loss of trust in governments, partisan polarization, populism. So there are lots of issues. The technologies that will improve productivity will concern only a few companies, and this doesn't nurture a globalized progress. So you have to consider how we can organize work. When a company decides to automate a production chain or to relocate to another country, the local communities will suffer some damages, but this is not taken into account. So some economists have said that the traditional model of the welfare state is a bit archaic, is obsolete, because according to this model, there are good jobs that are accessible with a potential positive impact, and the appropriate strategy is to spend on education and training and to have a progressive system of transfers, tax transfers, insurance, but inequalities, economic imbalances are structural problems. And in fact, what is important is to better distribute employment and jobs. And this doesn't provide some stability, and people cannot climb up the career ladder. So, of course, what is important is to create good jobs. We'll be talking about that, Stefanie, STANTCHEVA, during the debate. So you can ask your questions on the site. Les rencontres économiques. Jean PISANI-FERRY, how can we combine all these proposals that we've just heard? So the title is the following, a paradigm shift. This is quite ambitious because a paradigm shift in terms of economic policies. We had a paradigm shift after World War II and in the 1980s. And do we have a paradigm shift today? So these are big cycles spanning 30 years or 40 years that will give a framework for the economic policies. So, of course, the objective is quite ambitious. I mean, you've raised different issues. As François says, there's a risk. So these are not small changes or fluctuations. 10 years ago, we had a financial crisis. Today, we have the COVID crisis. We might have a geopolitical environmental crisis in 10 years or in 20 years' time. So I can tell you that we are dealing with extreme shocks. We thought that the final financial crisis could occur every 100 years. But now we are facing another crisis. And remember that we had a financial crisis 10 years ago. So in order to change the situation, we should have more proactive policies. It's important, I mean, to have more capabilities and capacities. And then you have the European question. And François and Jörg have talked about that. What is the magnitude of change that we are witnessing? François VILLEROY said that we should have a common budget policy. We have an initiative, a common initiative. We don't have a system. So what we are implementing is to come up with a one-off answer to a specific crisis. It is not yet a permanent system. Are we laying the cornerstones of a permanent system? That's a significant debate. Third, so you have climate change, so we need to change our approach. Of course, we are not talking about degrowth because we don't want to have an economy in the future that is similar to that we experienced during the lockdown. So if we want a new economy, it's important, I mean, to invest. So, and last point, the labor market, the good jobs, and of course, people are dissatisfied with the labor market. The market economy has some negative effects. So we can launch educational policies or redistribution policies. So it's important to focus on the quality of jobs and the quality of the social system. So for the debate, Are we talking about a system, or are we talking about different initiatives that might be potentially contradictory? I will give you two examples. So reallocation. So we've suffered a shock, and with a shock, it will be necessary to reallocate. At the present time, we are preserving things, but in the future, we'll have to change things. The good jobs of today, they are in the aerospace industry, in the automotive industry, and they are being challenged. So, what kind of avenue are we embarking upon? A second question. Is it compatible with the growth pace? So in terms of growth, 1.5% for France, you have 1.4 productivity. So we'll say we will embark upon this ecological transition. This will require some investments. So it means that the purchasing power will be lessened so that it can be invested in regulations or in a carbon tax, but there will be a cost. There's some capital that we'll have to throw away because it doesn't suit today's requirements. So we'll have to reinvest. And second, when we say relocations, we've said that we want to have more autonomy, more sovereignty. This is linked with the idea of good jobs. So it means that globalization is the equivalent of a 13 additional month in terms of wages. But are we productive enough in order to grant a 13-month in terms of salary? So it won't be easy. So Jörg, KUKIES. So you've listened to Jean Pisani, but what about your proposals? Your proposals, can they be included into a system, a more federal Europe? Can we put all these measures and all these proposals together?
I mean, I think all parties for that and for a real structural change. Whether or not we embrace that is obviously up to us. The ideas that are presented for the recovery instrument have all of the components to move towards a stronger and deeper fiscal union in the long run. However, I think politically, realistically, we will only get a compromise if we declare the recovery instrument a one-off and once in a lifetime and it will never happen again kind of instrument. There's many member states that absolutely insist on that. So in that sense, my prediction is that this will be sort of in the spirit of compromise.
Au niveau des investissements, vous parlez du Green Deal beaucoup. On parle beaucoup du Green Deal à Bruxelles.
In terms of investments, you talk a lot about Green Deal. In Brussels, they talk about the Green Deal. Are you in favor of this continuing over time?
Here to stay, no doubt about that. But the Green Deal, I think, is more of a question of prioritization of policy instruments. It doesn't change the foundation of the European Union. You won't need a treaty change of the European Union to focus more financing on the Green Deal, right? So I think the Green Deal is permanent, but it doesn't require any of the very sort of changes to the architecture of the European Union. Whereas deepening the fiscal union, I do think requires that, and I do think there's a correlation between the two elements because I do think once we implement this the recovery instrument, we will see that every member state doing their own fiscal policy on environmental taxes doesn't lead to the optimal outcome. It's the classic externalities question, why it makes sense, for example, to move taxation of environmental issues to the union level. That's why I think the ETS system should be expanded. Why, for example, the taxation of air travel should be done at the union level, the taxation of sea travel. A lot of these things, which by nature cannot be captured at the national level, should be moved towards a true fiscal capacity for the European Union. And if you manage that, then it could become very interesting, because then all elements, expenditures, raising debt and raising taxes, would be there.
François Villeroy de Galhau, est-ce que vous pouvez compléter cette...
François Villeroy de Galhau, can you add to this answer? Yes, well, I believe we have to base this on the right question by Jean Pisani. Can this be turned into a system? Well, my answer is I believe it's possible, but it's not certain. Let me illustrate this with this famous European package we're talking a lot about this morning. I mentioned the condition of a European added value, and I would like to mention three elements so that we all understand. First of all, about figures. It so happens that the total package of the Commission is 750 billion, but if you look at the distribution, over 90% are envelopes that have been pre-distributed to member states, and in the coming weeks we'll really have some almost bartering about that. Then there's 46 billion, which is not huge, which is about 5% of the total, which is there for investments and to support the equity of companies and enable them to invest. Obviously, we expect some leverage with the Green Deal, but you have to preserve and increase this part of the package if possible. It's the most interesting part of the package, and it's the one that is less mentioned. Second thing, for climate transition, we have to aim at a higher price of carbon, and if possible, harmonize it throughout Europe. We have a system of carbon permits, which exists in Europe and not elsewhere. We'll probably have to aim towards a carbon tax at the border at one point or another if we want to have a fair trade within globalization. But this is there to fight against climate change, because all the action is taken will have a proper impact. But if we do not increase the carbon price, we won't make it. And third thing, I'm not a fan of the expression "good job," but there's one thing I do believe, it is the European social model. I believe that Europe has a word to say in the world about social dialogue, protection of staff, improving the conditions of work. We shouldn't just forget this and say we're condemned to a liberal wave or to what is being done in the emerging countries. We have to think about that. So, talking about this carbon tax, I would like to hear Jörg, KUKIES, and Claire Vaison. This carbon tax at the border, is something we've been talking about for many years. I think I've heard about it since I became a journalist. Well, two things. Both are important, but the first one that François Villeroy de Galhau was mentioning is very important. It's the internal price of carbon within Europe, because it's the easiest way of guiding investments towards activities that are compatible with the climate change issue. So this is a way of guiding Europe towards the proper behaviors. Is it easy? Well, we saw that in France with the yellow vests. We can see that it's extremely complex. And when you think of the relative price of carbon, you have to think of the mechanisms of a social buffer that have to go with it. So I do hope we'll have this carbon tax, and I do tell everyone, and I do hope that the discussions in the coming months will enable us to progress on in this field. We need to have the right trajectory, and I agree with François Villeroy de Galhau. And This is an addition because, and in addition, because of the relative competitiveness of Europe with the rest of the world, we'll need a carbon tax at the border. So both are important, internal tax and also carbon tax at the border. Your cookies, what is your position concerning carbon tax within Europe and at the border? L'an dernier, on a déjà décidé de cette taxe carbone qui va être introduite progressivement. Et dans le même temps, nous apportons des incitations.
So that will be an additional sanctioning mechanism, and at the same time, we're introducing programs for the hydrogène vert, as I heard before. So I think all of those issues go in the same direction, namely a promotion of reducing our carbon footprint, either through taxes or incentives or prohibitions. Those are the elements of our national policy. Now, I think it's very obvious, and we think that to promote the same idea at the European level, we will have to expand our ETS system, and we will have to think about changes to our energy taxation directive. Unfortunately, that has been in place since 2004, and any change to it has been blocked. And I think there it's another issue that we will need an institutional change in Europe, namely to move away from unanimity voting on all matters regarding taxation, because if we stay at unanimity voting, I doubt that we'll ever achieve progress on either introducing a Europe-wide unified carbon tax or in introducing a carbon adjustment tax. Or many other tax issues. So I think that's a very big institutional change that needs to be made much more broadly. The border adjustment tax is something that we are open to and we are keen to look at. However, we are completely aware of the massive complexity of actually implementing it, of getting it in a form that is in compliance with the World Trade Organizational norms, that is manageable. I mean, if you think of how many parts whose production used carbon is in a vehicle, in a mobile phone, and in a machine, it is an enormously complex issue to calculate a carbon adjustment, a border adjustment tax properly, given the deep integration of the global value chain. So we are completely open to considering this and to looking at it, but I think it would be an illusion to think that this will be something that comes quickly and that comes without controversy at the global level.
STANTCHEVA.
STANTCHEVA, talking about good jobs and the question by Jean PISANI-FERRY. He said he asked whether it could be compatible with the actual productivity pace. Well, this is a very good question. In fact, this new strategy, I believe, should abandon the traditional separation between the growth policy and the job policy. It is important that new technologies should be widely distributed and that there should be production opportunities for SMEs and the working populations rather than staying with the large companies. So it's a win-win solution. The better perspectives of employment will improve the situation concerning inequalities or lack of safety, more than traditional fiscal policies. But obviously, it requires a counterpart between private and public companies. Companies need a reliable, qualified staff and good access to technology and a solid system of contracts and laws. And all this comes from the public part of this pack, the governmental part of the pack. The government needs companies to internalize these externalities of employment. And it is necessary for them to take into account the good of the communities around. And they must therefore make a commitment not within their social responsibility, but also with a clear commitment with governments. This means active policies concerning labor that are there to increase competencies and employability and aiming clearly at job creation. So the tax incentives and others could be replaced by the implementation of proper services, for example. And this money could be used to direct investment towards a more favorable direction for employment. If you think of the European Green Deal, it could be used specifically for the creation of jobs in communities that are lagging behind. Jean PISANI-FERRY? Well, 2 points. One, to answer to what Stefanie STANTCHEVA said. We understand when we listen to you what it means for the U.S. The U.S. is a country where technology is being developed. You have superstar companies and places where the technology is deplorable. I don't understand so well what it means for Europe, collective negotiations, training efforts, minimum wages. We have all that. So what does it mean for Europe? And another thing about climate change. The present situation, and I turn to Claire, today, when a company has to pick between green or brown investment, what do they do? I don't know what the climate policy will be. I don't know if there'll be an eco tax. So I guess that if I'm in charge of a company, I would be waiting, which is exactly what you shouldn't do today. Today we need, in this specific phase of where we try to have an economic recovery, we need a lot of clarity, which we do not have. It's not, if we wait because it's too complicated, if we discuss forever, we're going to create economic attentism. I guess that all your auditors know Engie well, but a few years ago we were GDF Suez. So we have a DNA which is clear, and we try to green it. It's a company that decided a few years ago to aim at energy transition. And what we did is we divided by 2 our greenhouse gas emissions between 2016 and 2020, and our next objective is a new division by 2. So we have a carbon budget, we have a trajectory of emissions, and we check that the choices we make are along those lines. And we look at the price of carbon price of Europe, but it's very complex because it's rather uncertain. What is this price of carbon? I think it's 100 euros per ton for 2030, which is low. It is low. It is low if you look at the quantitative objectives, but the most important thing is that we have an envelope, a carbon budget, and our investments must fit with them. And to link this to Stefanie's good jobs, we are, with energy transition, we are much more attractive. A company as Engie receives 3 times more job applications than before we took the turn. Obviously, it was before the crisis. Stefanie STANTCHEVA, can you answer this question about good jobs in Europe? Is there really a concern there? I believe that there are concerns everywhere, which is why we're holding this discussion. There are divides in many developed countries, whether it be in the US or in Europe. We clearly see that this is a society with two levels, two speeds, and this globalization and the new technologies tend to exclude a large part of the population in some areas, in some sectors, given the level of education. And this is in favor of a kind of economic elite, and some part of the population can benefit from the new technologies and mainly lives in the big cities, and this is clear. We can see that the average or middle class is a gap that is the middle class that can benefit from this technology. This the gap is widening. We see that in Europe, and we see it in the US as well. So it has a cost, the fact that the technology is not developing. It has a social cost, also in terms of a populist vote, and we've seen that in the US. Okay. I agree with the phenomena, but the answers, the solutions you have suggested already exist in Europe. In the US, you have no public vocational training. The minimum wage is a few dollars, much lower than in France, than in Europe. So what can Europe do? Well, many things are being done in the US as well, along those lines. And there's many things being done in Europe as well. What is lacking is the introduction of changes. When you organize a training program, it must be dissociated. It is dissociated from the needs of the companies or local needs or regional needs. There are good examples in France with some specific schools and in other countries. But what you need is to have a constant link with the labor market and a constant dialogue between companies and government. Training is something that can be guided. The present incentives aim at destroying jobs more than something else. So we should think of incentives to create jobs rather than destroying them. François Villeroy de Galhau. I believe that what we're rediscovering is that one of the things that is defining Europe is its social model. It's not something of the past. It's not obsolete, and we can be proud of it. Okay, we make it even stronger, but I believe Europe has the keys for modernity in this field. I would like to add something about the price of carbon, because it's very important, and what your KUKIES said is very true, and he's right in saying that we should get rid of unanimous vote in terms of fiscality. So there is an elephant in the studio, I would say, not an elephant from Africa or Asia, but the elephant of America. It's the result of the US elections. Thinking of what we are saying, if Joe Biden is elected, I'm not saying it will solve everything, but it will be a game changer, because part of his program is the renewal of the U.S. with the Paris agreements. But there's a necessary battle, for example, that of WTO, which will depend a lot on what happens in the U.S. So we Europeans can make progress, but it would be even better if we were not on our own. One thing, do you agree with the vision of Mr. Villeroy de Galhau, your KUKIES?
Sorry, that was a question to me?
Oui. Oui.
Yes.
Yes. Are you also hoping for the arrival of the Democrats in the U.S.?
German government doesn't make any comments about the desirability or any kind of elections in the United States. What I can absolutely agree with François is that the election result will have a very significant impact on all of these global debates on taxation. So I think that's something we can all agree on. And obviously, as we can see with the current discussion around the digital taxation and the minimum taxation, it is obviously a huge. It has a huge impact on the outcome of these negotiations and the likelihood that they succeed. What position the United States government takes. So I think that's something that will always be the case. And hopefully we can bring all of these global taxation treaties to a good result. But I agree with François that it's extremely important that these things aren't done in isolation only in Europe, but also at a global level.
Alors on va prendre.
So if you don't mind, we're going to take questions that are being asked on the platform of lesrencontreséconomiques.fr. A question from Olivier. A change of paradigm might also be seen as the cancellation of the debt bought by the central banks to help countries get out of the crisis. François VILLEROY de GALHAU, what do you think of that? It's a question that has been asked several times in our country over the past few weeks. Jean PISANI-FERRY has written something very interesting là-dessus. But let me answer. It's an attractive idea, but I believe it's an illusion. It's not it's not something due to a legal impediment, but it's it's a question of trust. Even if we were able to do that, we wouldn't gain anything. You gain on the one hand with the cancellation of the debt, but you lose the same sum on the other side because you dig a hole in the balance of the central bank. So there's other ways of managing things over time with growth and control of spending, but don't keep this illusion. Would that be a solution?
Over the past few months is exactly what we need. We need to balance what monetary policy does in its complete independence, which I don't want to and can't comment on, but which has certainly helped the European Union and the Eurozone fight the crisis and also the last crisis. But what has been missing is a unified fiscal response from the European Union. And that, I think, is the big signal of hope from this crisis, that both on the national level, all of the fiscal policies are in sync. And that is a big difference to the 2009 response to the crisis. And the second big difference, which I think is extremely important, is that we're now converging towards a more common fiscal policy at the European level. So I think that gives a lot of hope to this big additional pillar to monetary to our union, namely to integrate monetary policy and fiscal policy. If you want, that's one of the missing elements of the construction of the European Union, that we have a very unified monetary policy, but we have very idiosyncratic and individualized fiscal policies. And if we agree and converge more on the fiscal policy side, both in terms of the choices we make and perhaps even institutionally, that would be the biggest progress that we could make, I think.
Merci. On continue, si vous le voulez bien, avec cette question.
Thank you very much. Let's continue with Nicolas' question. I turn to Stefanie STANTCHEVA. A new paradigm, can that be that of degrowth? This is a very good question. As I answered Jean, there's no conflict between growth and the creation of good jobs. It's something that is mutually reinforcing. The idea is not to stop globalization or say no to new technologies. The idea is to do more so that globalization and new technologies benefit to more people. And the solutions I mentioned go along those lines. And one of the things that must be done is the introduction of a new social dialogue. It's true we have one, but it's becoming more and more difficult because more and more people are out of the system. And what we need is data about practical elements such as production and jobs, but also data that reveal what people are thinking, and that and this is invisible. So a new social dialogue, but how? Well, one of the things that could be crucial would be to connect these data concerning perceptions and attitude. So I'm not talking about opinion surveys, but surveys that are well organized and represent a political tool. Are you leaving the social partners aside? Was this the labor partners? No. We need clear, serious organization so that people trust things. If people know that their opinion is taken into account, well, it will play a role in knowing what are the good jobs, what is the impact. Sorry, Stefanie STANTCHEVA, we only have 2 minutes left. Claire Vaison, would you like to react? Yes, very quickly, two things. I agree with Stefanie. There can be both growth and employment. While aiming at transition and carbon neutrality. The green jobs can be good jobs, and they lead the economy in the right direction. Very quickly to answer what Jean said about transition and its cost. It's true that it's costly to move towards zero carbon. Green energies are more costly than non-green economies, but one thing, when you consume less, it's a way of reconciling what we call the end of the world and end of the month. Second thing, you should not get misled in the mix of green energies. We are in a world where the relative price of energies is changing very quickly. 10 years ago, if we had looked at how we could decarbonize the energy mix, the nuclear energy seemed to be the clear choice. It's no longer the case. So be careful. We have to be sufficiently open concerning new technologies. You have methane, green hydrogen. Let's see if they're competitive, because we don't know what the decarbonated mix for 2030, 2050 will be, especially the cheapest one. Okay, so you are not looking at the degrowth policy. Okay, Jean PISANI-FERRY, 1 minute to conclude the discussion. Well, it's very difficult to summarize things. Maybe we should start from the initial question. Where do we stand? At what point in our economic history do we stand? Is there a real question about a paradigm shift? Many people say we need to change the system, but in this particular case, there is a conjunction of mutations, shocks, dissatisfactions that are forcing us along those lines. How long is it going to take? Well, historically, things take time. You can't do such a shift in 6 months. It takes about a decade, and you're looking for the right solution. So we're in difficult times, and this is when things are designed. But let's be clear, this is what we must do today. We must redefine the elements of our growth regime. So the will must be there. Thank you very much for participating.